Come on up. I'm just going to dial up your slideshow for you.
I don't need anything right now.
Oh, that's not yours. You don't need?
No, we can leave it off right now.
Okay.
If
Okay.
I need it, I'll have it turned off. Just put this over here. Just make sure that all of you can hear me. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. This is my first visit to Idaho, and I'm very pleased to have spent a day learning a little bit about Idaho history yesterday. I come from Boston, and I have the very typical understanding of the map of the United States. There's nothing in between the East Coast and the West Coast, and now I am here in Idaho, and I've learned that there is something between. Very lovely. Jane Robbins has given you the kind of legal background and historical background to some extent for Common Core. I'm going to be talking about 3 different topics that run into each other before you have a break for some questions, because they're all related. The issue she ended up with is the issue that I have focused on almost totally from the very beginning, because it was my major concern when I was in the Department of Education in Massachusetts from 1999 to 2003. I was in charge of revising or developing all of the state's K-12 standards at that time. And so I learned a lot about how to make standards, what standards are, how to get them written, what a document that's going to be teacher-friendly, so something happens, it has to look like, and how you get standards written so that assessment committees can use it, because there are many uses for a good set of standards, and my goal was a first-class set of standards for Massachusetts. That was the same idea that I brought to my looking at Common Core, even before I was placed on the validation committee, which I will tell you about third in the points that I'm going to cover. My concern has been from the beginning, are these good, high-quality academic standards? Are they rigorous? I'll start out with that term because it has been used by everybody. It's as if there are parrots going around this country all day long, from superintendents and school offices in particular, saying these are rigorous standards. The word rigorous is used over and over again. Rigor mortis would be more like it, but rigorous is the word that is used. And the question is, who is saying they are rigorous? Some of what I will say in math will be picked up by my fellow speaker, because that is his area of specialty, but I will mention this a little bit because when we were on the validation committee, we were expected to comment on anything. They didn't really care what our expertise was in. Mine has always been in reading and literacy, literature study, literary study, English language arts. Who has said they are rigorous? Because why would you spend money on non-rigorous standards? That's where, to me, you begin. If you don't have a first-class set of standards for a state, for a country, for a school, why bother with them? Why implement them in classrooms? Why spend money on testing? Why spend money on professional development? Why spend money on textbooks that are aligned to them? So you start with what is the quality. And people would, in the world of common sense, bring the same criteria to the purchase of a car or a home. Depending on their pocketbooks, they would look for the quality they want, the features that define quality, in any major purchase. So where does rigor come in, and who says they are rigorous? Let's begin very briefly with the math standards. They will be amplified later by someone who knows mathematics, because I am not a mathematician. Two of the standards writers themselves have said, and one of them said this at a Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Education meeting, because I asked him, Jason Zimba, I said, describe in lay terms college readiness. My aim was to figure out what college readiness meant. After all, that's the name of these standards. They're college and career ready. It's the first time we've had standards in this country. And this was the clue to me that this was going to be something different. All the other standards we have at the state level are simply called standards or state standards. But these were called college and career ready standards. Something was going on because they had a name that really that was very important to understand. So what did Jason Zimba reply at this open meeting that I had asked for while I was on the Board of Education? And he said, it's a very minimal meaning. It means students are ready for a non-selective college. I was the only one that asked the question. My fellow board members simply ignored it. Didn't matter. When the chair was asked later on why Massachusetts gave up its first-class standards for Common Core, this was in July of 2010, she said, well, they had higher expectations. Clearly something was going on behind the scenes. So from the perspective of math, we know from the horse's mouth that these standards are not rigorous. In English language arts, it's a little harder to tell, so I'm going to go into some detail about that as part of my next piece. We have never heard from the standards writers in English language arts themselves that these are rigorous standards, and their names are David Coleman and Susan Pimentel. They have never, at least to my knowledge, said these are rigorous standards. It's everybody else that says it. All of the people that the Gates Foundation has funded in different organizations or even as individuals, and state superintendents and district superintendents all say they're rigorous. What does rigor mean? Even reporters, unfortunately, the media repeats, these are rigorous standards. These are going to be more demanding standards. And one has to ask, well, what do you mean by it? What are you looking at? So this is what I'm going to talk about very briefly. What do you look at? In math, it's easier, and Zev will talk about that. You look at the topics. In science, you can do the same thing. You look at the topics that are required at the high school level, and that's where my focus is going to be, because it's easier to understand rigor when you look at what is going to be required of all students in order to be determined as college ready or college and career ready. So you can look at topics in math or science, but you don't have topics for the most part in the English language arts. What you do have in a curriculum, which is different from a set of standards, you have certain texts to read. And it's those texts that the teacher chooses for the classroom curriculum that help to decide how rigorous that curriculum is. Now, it's not the complete determinant because you have a cut score or a pass score that will then appear once you've given a test. You can have a very high demanding test and then set such a low cut score that everyone passes, so you cannot say you necessarily have rigorous standards. You might say the standards look rigorous, but in actual fact, by the time you get around to choosing who's passing and failing, it turns out that the rigor isn't there. But we can't even go up to the passing score or the cut score because it hasn't been determined yet. This is going to be another game that will be played out very interestingly in public in the next couple of years once the tests are ready to be given and are given. But you can certainly look at the rigor of the texts that are being assigned, and that's one of the things I want to point out is what I have done. There is an Appendix B that does contain some examples of what are called levels of complexity in English. But when you look at the high school level examples of complexity, it turns out that they cover a wide range of levels of reading difficulty. And when Renaissance Learning, a company in Wisconsin that puts out Accelerated Reader, a program that's in many libraries and public schools, some of you may know about it, it has a website that gives you the a readability formula application to almost anything that would be assigned in K-12. And when they did a study of whatever titles are in that list in Appendix B, it turns out that the average reading level is about 6th to 7th grade. This is for the high school exemplars. This is to at least help reporters and others understand where do you go to look to find out about reading difficulty. Now, English teachers don't need readability formulas. A well-trained English teacher can look at a work and know what its complexities are, how difficult it may be for different age groups, and they can look at the subject matter and decide whether it's appropriate for elementary or high school. But even the catch is that we have a lot of works today. Grapes of Wrath is one, a lot of the works by Hemingway and Steinbeck that are written at a very easy level. They come in at a grade 5 or 6 level, but they're mature in their themes and in their subject matter. So they're given at the high school level. The problem is that a steady diet of such works does not prepare you for reading college-level textbooks because, as people have discovered recently, college-level textbooks are written at an adult level. Lo and behold, who writes college-level textbooks? The people often who teach at the college level. And it is assumed that if you are at any college, at any post-secondary institute, you are an adult, and therefore you're capable of reading adult textbooks or other materials, given that you would then have to understand the technical vocabulary of whatever the subject is. So that becomes how you have to start looking at rigor in the English language arts. You have to get a sense of what is the reading level of the work. Can you find a readability formula which is objective, not some English teacher or some other person's judgment, because you want an objective measure. Readability formulas I won't go into in detail, but what they get at is vocabulary level or vocabulary load and sentence structure difficulty. They're objective measures, and they've been used by publishers for maybe 80 years in this country to adjust the reading level of textbooks, not literature, because there are other things going on in a literary work. No literary writer writes according to a readability formula, because that wouldn't be a work of literature. But in any event, that is part of what you look at. You look at the reading level of what is there in the curriculum, which means that a parent or a reporter would have to go to the teacher or the school and say, what is it you are assigning in grades 9, 10, 11, and 12? That's why it's hard to talk about the rigor of the Common Core English Language Arts standards, because they're not a curriculum. They're simply rather empty statements of skills. Now I'm getting into the second part, which is where we're talking about the flaws in the Common Core ELA standards in general. There are at least 4 or 5 major flaws, and I'm talking about a big picture look at these standards. One of the reasons, I think, because I've been puzzling about this for 3 years, how did over 45 state boards of education, and these are all educated people for the most part, intelligent people, certainly the ones in Massachusetts, my colleagues on the board were, how did they vote in a set of standards that were so non-rigorous? How did they not ask any questions about college readiness? Not one of them, I was the only one in Massachusetts, wanted to know what it meant. How come they didn't ask any questions? And I've come to the conclusion that they don't know how to look at a set of standards and analyze it. They can read the words that are in an English set of standards. They certainly can't do much with math or science unless they're in the field to begin with. But reporters don't know how to look at and analyze, compare standards. Superintendents don't know how to analyze and compare sets of standards. They're very difficult documents to grab hold of. What do you look at? And one of the only tools that are used by departments of education staff across this country has the bizarre name of crosswalk. And I've had many legislators say to me, what is a crosswalk? Well, you lay down a set of standards here, and you lay down another set of standards there, and then you go back and forth to see whether the content in one set is covered or omitted or in some way handled in the other set. That is as far as all of the research groups have done, by the way, in comparing. They've done crosswalks. Well, that is not a way to actually get at the big picture, because the big picture starts with the organization of the standards, and the crosswalk doesn't tell you that. You have to have a way of looking at how is a subject or a discipline conceptualized organizationally. What are the major strands? Do they make sense? Is that what people in the field who teach this subject would agree to? There are a whole host of non-objective questions, but they are the most important ones. And when you look at Common Core, it has very serious flaws. First of all, I'm going to start with an easy one that I just discovered only last week. You can look at the number of standards in a document. This is also a clue. Common Core has a division into the language processes: reading, writing, speaking, listening, and then something it calls language, which includes conventions and vocabulary. I won't go into the details of that because that's also revealing too, because it has very important implications for the curriculum and what teachers teach and how they teach and what they put together. But when you look at just the number of standards at each grade level in Common Core, you suddenly discover, as I did, that there are more writing than reading standards at all grade levels. Now, someone might say, so what? Who cares if there are more writing than reading standards? Well, this is my area of expertise. I did graduate work in reading and reading research. And one of the things we know, not only on the basis of common sense, but from reading research, is that the basis for all academic work is good reading skills, and it comes from lots of reading. It doesn't come from lots of writing. It turns out that writing is dependent on reading. Good writing is dependent on good reading, and we know that good writers are always good readers. Not all good readers become good writers, but all good writers have been good readers. You cannot become a good writer without having absorbed through the reading process for over many, many years the quality of the language that you are learning to write, and in this case it's English. So it's that reading practice that makes all the difference in the world. But Common Core switches it. Why? I'm just going to give you my casual answer without any backup for it, because its architects didn't know. They had no knowledge. They had never taught K-12. David Coleman, Sue Pimentel. They had no background in K-12 education. They had never done any research on their own in the field. So they didn't know that writing is dependent on reading. So you don't want a document that forces teachers to spend more time on writing than reading, and that is what Common Core is doing all the way through. It is penalizing, in essence, the most vulnerable children in our school system, because who will be the good readers? The kids whose home lives stimulate and support a lot of reading. But this is a world of research that is outside the knowledge base of the people who developed Common Core. So you have more writing than reading. But what they did do that should have been the tip-off that there's a real problem with these standards is the way they organized reading. They divided the reading standards from kindergarten through grade 12 into 10 standards for what they called informational text and 9 standards for literature or literary study. What this means is, for the secondary English teacher, which is where you really need to zero in, is that you must reduce literary study under Common Core, and this is what English teachers have been busily complaining about all across this country, because they've been told less than 50% literature, and you must increase something called informational text. Now, the word nonfiction is sometimes used, but it doesn't matter whether it's called nonfiction or informational text. The main subject matter of the English class at the secondary level, historically, has been literary study. That's what English teachers are trained for. That's what they study when they go to college and major in English. So how did this get tipped? Well, they have a peculiar reason. You spend your adult life reading more information than literature. Probably most of us do, unless we are professors of literature. And therefore, what you do as an adult means that we have to do that in the English class in K-12. It's a logical non sequitur. Has nothing to do with what you train teachers in terms of, or train children in terms of what they study in the reading of the English class in English language arts. Literature is the subject matter, and that is where critical thinking is developed, which is the third major flaw, is that even though they claim, and Jane Robbins mentioned that they have these very pretentious-sounding claims, Common Core will lead to deeper learning. It will develop critical thinking. It may brush your hair, shine your shoes, may do all kinds of interesting things. The question is, how can it possibly do it with those words on paper? And if you continue to claim that it's going to develop critical thinking, you have to have some idea, well, how does critical thinking ordinarily get developed in an English class? Typically, it gets developed when kids study complex literature, very difficult, complex literature, and students learn to read between the lines. Even a simple Wordsworth poem can be useful for that purpose. You learn to read between the lines of complex literature, and that's where you learn how to think critically or analytically. Now, you have to understand that there's also a little game going on with the meaning of the word critical. Critical doesn't mean negative thinking. It should mean analytical thinking, and that's what you're really aiming for. How do kids learn to be analytical in their orientation to a text so they don't believe everything the snake oil salesman is telling them? Well, we haven't had much evidence of analytical or critical thinking about Common Core standards. So we have more writing than reading, less literature than informational, and we have a decreased opportunity to develop critical thinking skills. Yet, and this is the next flaw, the standards are not standards of content. They don't indicate anything, for the most part, of substance. They're about skills, finding the main idea, finding out how characters and plots interact with each other. I'd have to read them, but I would be sounding sarcastic because some of them are so poorly written that one would laugh because they're not anything an English teacher has ever written. I respect good English teachers at the high school level, and no English teacher ever touched those English language arts standards. No self-respecting English teacher could have ever written that kind of prose. They just don't. They learn how to write good English prose. So at least a well-trained, experienced English teacher. That was why the Massachusetts standards, by the way, were so good, because we had high school English teachers writing the high school literature standards. That was what made them credible and acceptable, and they were written in a language that other English teachers could accept and understand. So you have the skills, not content, and then the final major flaw, because I won't go into the weeds at this point, is the lack of coordination between reading and writing standards. And this was an insight that I realized a number of months ago when I began to look at middle grade teachers who were trying to get their kids to write. Now, this is in 6th and 7th grade, and if you have children that age, you will understand the problem. They wanted them to write, after reading a little short story, about claims with evidence. And these teachers were developing commercial worksheets or their own to structure the kids' writing, because these kids in 6th and 7th grade didn't know how to write with a claim. What is a claim? When do you learn to write with a claim? 6th graders can't even conceptualize. They can understand a baggage claim, but they don't know what a claim is in a piece of writing, that what a lawyer would understand as a claim, or what a rhetorician would understand. I'm making a claim, and here's my evidence. What could they claim about a short story? They weren't even giving the right kind of reading model. And this is one thing we also know from research, that if you want children to learn how to write an essay, you begin to feed them some essays beforehand so that they have the model of what an essay looks like, with a controlling idea, a thesis, or whatever you want to call it. But they have to see what these things look like in reading They're very difficult conceptually to come up with. If you know people who can come up with a snap of a finger with a thesis statement, these are usually people that you put on show, because it's very hard to come up with a thesis statement, as any teacher will tell you. It takes a while to develop one. You have to have some material, and then you have to decide what it is you're really trying to say, and so forth. So you've got all these flaws with Common Core. Then I want to go to the Validation Committee. Tell me how much time, please, I have. Okay. Before there's a Q&A. I was then put on the Validation Committee in September 2009, and I really had to campaign to get on that committee too, which was another thing that sort of startled me. After the work I had done in Massachusetts, at least I should have been on one of the committees without having to fight for it, but I literally had to get 10 organizations to sponsor me so I could get onto the committee, because I wanted to be part of the Validation Committee. What was the Validation Committee? Turned out, as we discovered, it was set up to be a rubber stamp, and the last thing I am is a rubber stamp. I've been on many local committees in my hometown, and I had been on my library board for 14 years. I was a town meeting member for 10 years. I was never a rubber stamp. I was one of those people who always asked questions. I mean, whether people could answer them or not was a separate story, but at least I was always asking questions, because that is what an informed citizen does. So on this Validation Committee, we were charged with validating whatever the standards writers were coming up with. And I would write voluminous critiques. They're available. I can share them, and I've shared some of them with other people who've asked. I never got a reply to any of them. We were supposed to be interacting with the standards writers. We were told we couldn't write the standards or rewrite them, but we could critique them because we were supposed to ensure that they were, quotes, internationally benchmarked, that they were research-based, that the process that was used was an appropriate process, and of course I said it was in violation of every civic procedure I had ever participated in, because we were given a set of criteria in May of 2010. There were 25 to 29 people on this Validation Committee. I and the only mathematician on the Validation Committee were 2 of the 5 people who did not sign off. That was why we refused to be rubber stamps, because we couldn't say they were internationally benchmarked, they weren't research-based, the process that was used was not an open process. We were even given confidentiality forms to sign when we became members of this committee. Now, why was that possible? Because the groups that developed the standards were private groups. They were not public groups. You couldn't FOIA them. You still can't. Reporters can't FOIA them. There have been reporters, because I've told a few reporters to try. You can't FOIA a private group. You can only FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, I'm sorry. You can only ask for information from public bodies. And there, of course, you have sunshine laws that apply. So you can have minutes of meetings, summaries, you know what's happened behind the scenes. You can't get any of that information to this day from the 2 groups. All you get is a very brief little report called the Report of the Validation Committee that was done by somebody who was paid to do it, and all he could do, his name is Dennis Doyle, and he is an honorable person so far as I'm concerned, he was putting together this report based on whatever CCSSO and the NGA chose to give him. Because I called him up after the Validation Committee finished its work, and I had passed in my set of comments saying that I couldn't sign off on this set of criteria. And I saw this little report that was on the web for a while, and I said, "Did you know that there were 5 of us that didn't sign on?" He said, "No, I was never given that information." In other words, even as the report writer himself, he could not have access to the information about what went on in the committee. All he could write up was what he was told, the dates, the names of the places where we met, the meetings, and so forth, and who the members were. That was it. And so you did not have a validation process. Now, let me ask you to think about this, because I used to do this as a sort of game. If you were developing college readiness standards that might become national standards, but even in your own state, if you were to develop college readiness standards, who would be the people you would want to ask to judge in math and English? Remember, those are the only two subjects right now that Common Core has developed. Who would you ask ordinarily to tell you about the standards or the content you would want for the college readiness level? You would want professors, people who teach freshman college students math or English, and you would want some of the high school teachers in math or English. I mean, that would be common sense. Those were the two groups excluded. Now, that tells you something right there. The two groups that are excluded, basically, are the two groups who should be the people, not test makers. You don't want test makers deciding college readiness. You don't want policy makers who don't know anything about math necessarily or literature. The two groups that should have been there were not there. When I was on the validation committee, there wasn't one English teacher when I got on the committee, and I screamed about that, and they finally appointed one high school English teacher eventually over the course of the year to be on that committee. But the point was, it wasn't a valid validation committee, and you didn't have a valid process for validating the set of standards. So you have fraudulent standards to begin with that are being peddled. Our state superintendents are claiming they're rigorous. They're claiming they're internationally benchmarked, which means that they're comparable to the best sets of standards in high-achieving countries, and they're not, and that they're research-based. And I, of course, knew in English language arts that they weren't. Am I just about up? Okay. I'm going to stop at this point because this is where it tells you may have some live questions regarding the quality of the English language arts standards or the validation process, and then we'll go on to some of the other meaty issues that involve implementation and testing, which is, of course, where all of this was supposed to be going. I mean, it wasn't to stop with the standards. Do you want to?
I just want a little housekeeping tidbit here. Since this is an interactive Q&A, we have a couple of young staffers here in their red shirts that have some microphones. If you want to raise your hand, got a question, they'll zip over to you so that we can all hear the questions. So just ask periodically where the questions are, and our girls will run around and find them.
Oh.
They're in the room.
Okay. Can I have a few questions brought up? Is that how? Oh, they have a mic. Okay. Yeah. Oh, she'll give you the mic. That's
My name
fine.
is David Ryan. How's that? Now
Thank you. Much better.
We're very concerned about what's going on as a company who publishes reading instructional materials, and we have come out decidedly against Common Core. Now, you just raised a question about validation committees in my mind. Your experience was with the Validation Committee of Massachusetts, and I'm wondering, are the similar committees throughout the states composed in a similar way? For instance, would the Validation Committee for Idaho be of the same typical composition as that which you experienced? No professors.
That's an interesting question. At the state level, it's handled differently because you have a set of public procedures that you have to follow for public comment drafts. You send drafts of standards out. I'm sure Idaho must have had something similar for its own standards. You send them out and you get feedback from teachers or others, and then the department staff has to respond in some way to what the public has written, whether it's an organization or an individual, and that's your validating procedure. That your standards meet with favor with those who are going to use it in the schools, or with the parents, whoever has chosen to respond. And what the department has to do, because they are public servants, as opposed to CCSSO and NGA, which are not public servants, but department staff are public servants, and so what we had to do whenever we got feedback on public comment drafts was to put together the comments and indicate to the Board of Education and to the public, to the media, how we were handling the comments. Were we accepting these and why? Were we rejecting these and why? In other words, we had to have a rationale for what was going into the standards. NGA, the Common Core standards didn't have to observe any of that. That was why this validation committee was set up, because it was not going to have the public comment process that takes place in every state, because every state has similar procedures to make sure.
I may add here, Common Core published one public version of the standards in March of 2010 for public comment, 30 days or so. They got over 10,000 comments for both English and mathematics. They published back 6 pages of response, no quote of specific comment, 6 pages total, of which 3 pages were general verbiage about the process, how they collected the comments, how they analyzed them, and here are the 3 pages of actual response. Those are the issues that the commenters raised. That's it. No comment how they will respond to them, nothing specific. 10,000 comments, 3 pages back effectively. That's kind of feedback you were talking about.
And even worse was the fact that you can't get a hold of those comments because they're not available. In a Department of Education, Idaho, like other states, all of this is public information. If somebody sends anything in to a Department of Education, it's public information. It can be FOIA'd. And we were always constantly getting Freedom of Information Act requests. But NGO, CCSSO doesn't have to show any of the comments. I tried to get them when I was on the validation committee. I wanted to see what specific organizations or mathematicians had to say. They didn't have any obligation to give them to me, the copies. They still don't, and they didn't.
Any other questions so you don't get ready for the next round?
Yeah, whatever time you want.
First.
Go ahead.
Oh, my name is Ronald Linsenman, and many years ago in what we called the Education Wars of Goals 2000, in the language there was the NAEP test, and it was a federal offense, as we did our research, to understand parents, that was like you're saying, it was all secret. You could not get a copy of the NAEP test. And in those, I'm wondering in language arts, are there still going to be these camouflaged psychological assessments of students? They called it the locus of control, kind of the basis of a child's psychological or...
Well, I think you're asking about the data requirements, which will be addressed later on.
Oh, so I wondered if that was still going to be in some of the language arts.
It will be the topic is going to be addressed later, so I will not respond now, but that certainly is a major issue with the Common Core standards. Let's have any more that's relevant.
Hi, I'm Rick Jacob, and I'm an educator and administrator at a charter school. My teaching load is in social studies, and when we heard that there was this 50-50 literature and
informational text.
I got with my English teacher and I said, we discussed it, and we said we were not going to give up classics or any deeper complex readings, and that science and social studies would take over this informational text. My question is this going to be allowed? Will this be considered fair? Or are they going to expect our literature teachers to, that the percentage is going to be based on what they teach, not the whole high school?
You're asking questions that we really don't know the answers to yet, because I don't think they thought through what the test, who would be accountable for the test. If you're going to say the test has to have at least 50%, maybe more, of informational passages, And then and I don't want to go into the complications of the arithmetic on this, that 70% of the reading that kids do should be across the curriculum and other subjects. But if the test is called a reading test or an English test, is the English teacher alone responsible, or do we somehow divide up accountability with other teachers? I don't know how a superintendent would do that to begin with, but no one knows the answer to it, and it looks like, as far as we know, that the English teacher is the one who's going to be held responsible for all of this informational reading. So this was part of the muddle that was created by the authors of Common Core and was never addressed because it didn't go through a public process in which questions like that would be raised by the field, which would have been addressed if these were Idaho standards.
One thing that I would mention on that is that I think across the nation we're seeing that a lot of the bureaucrats who are in charge of this are just counting the standards. They're counting their 10 for informational, there are 9 for literary, therefore you will teach more informational than literary. And I know that in one large school district in Georgia, the English teachers have been instructed to spend 55% of their time on informational text. 55. And forget about across the whole curriculum. It's the English teachers are being expected to do it, and I suspect that's going on in a lot of places.
A major issue I'd like to add with regard to the question of the information is, what information are English teachers held accountable for? This has never been, literature has been what they've been held accountable for. So this is a whole other can of worms.
Last question.
Oh, we have one up there.
Dr. Stotsky, I think that most of us know here in Idaho in recent weeks and years that our education has not probably been the shining star of the state. That's real unfortunate because our kids are. But our kids can never be taught anymore or learn any more than what's been put on their educational plate. We have seen now since Common Core has come out, quite a few of us are beginning to make ourselves aware of what the content of that is. When we look at everything in education, whether you're an administrator in a public school, whether you're a teacher in a public school, whether you're a content writer, whether you run the content from the Department of Education, and everything comes back to zero, period. And we can look at our state standings to see that. How can we change that? How can we turn that around? Where do we start to make that different?
I'm going to give you some suggestions at the end of the day, because that is ultimately the $64 question. Where do states like Idaho go? They don't want to go back to what were probably weak standards to begin with. This is true of many, many states in the country. But there are alternatives to that. You don't advance by adopting Common Core. You actually go back 2 steps, I call it 2 steps backwards. And so the question is, instead of going back to what you had, are there some other alternatives? And I want to address those later on when we have time. But keep that, because that really is where the state and many other states have to go. I think it's time now for our next speaker.
Okay.